Sabah al-Khair, good morning dear listeners. You're listening to Radio 3CR on 855 AM and Palestine Remembered with Robert Martin, Nasser Mashni and Yusuf Ahmed al-Rimawi.
Palestine Remembered is Australia's only English language radio program that is totally dedicated to Palestine. We'd like to welcome those listening on 855 and those that will join us on podcast at 3cr.org.au.
Thanks for joining us. Stay with us and enjoy the episode.
Bringing you the news and views and the untold side of the Palestinian struggle for freedom from a Palestinian perspective. Good morning, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Palestine Remembered. Morning, Rob.
Good morning, Nasser. How are you? How are you, listeners?
I've had a couple of emails and texts. They're excited about talking to us live in person next week for Radiothon. So make sure you call in next week, 3CR for Radiothon. We need your support and donation. So make sure you call in and speak to Rob and I. But today we're speaking to a fantastic Palestinian out of Palestine. Today, Dr. Layth Hanbali. Layth is a freelance consultant focusing on health policy. He has also worked as a researcher, public health practitioner and doctor, volunteered as a civil society organizer, and taught on several global health programs. He earned a master's degree in health policy, planning, and financing from the London School of Economics and Political Science and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and a medical degree and a bachelor's degree in global health from University College in London. Welcome, Layth. You're a massive underperformer. Welcome to Palestine Remembered.
Thank you so much, Nasser. Thank you, Robert. Thank you for having me on the show and for your interest in my work.
Layth, we have varied Palestinian guests from all over the world, and invariably, many of them are highly educated like yourself. And one of the things, I don't know that we actually articulate it that often, but a reality of Palestinians in diaspora having been robbed of their lands, their home, their hope, in many cases. Education is thrust, and the demand for education is thrust upon us. And we're amongst the most educated people on earth. And certainly, Layth, you really honor us with being on the show. But we say in Arabic, you lift our heads. We're so very proud of you. Congratulations, Layth.
Nasser, that's really, really kind. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now, Layth, why don't you tell us a little bit about your Nakba story?
Of course. So my family, myself, I am from Nablus, which is about 60, 70 kilometers north of Jerusalem. That means that although like every other Palestinian city, it played a very active part in the growing political consciousness around Palestinian identity in particular. You know, there are lots of stories of the old cafes being hubs for that kind of organizing and that political consciousness growing. Nablus was not one of the places that was colonized in 1948. It came under Jordanian rule, but Nablus was forcefully occupied by Israel in the Nakba, which we mark the anniversary of this week. So in 1967, the Israeli tanks rolled into what remained of Palestine, and Nablus was one of those places, and it came under military rule at that point. I obviously wasn't there for that, but I was there growing up. Israeli military rule as a child in Nablus, still, despite being quite young when it happened, recall very vividly the Second Intifada in particular, when Israeli tanks, after kind of having withdrawn to the peripheries of the cities, rolled in and did untold damage to our communities, martyred hundreds of our people, and, stationed themselves in our houses and took over buildings, and you kind of heard constant shelling, and you'd know that you were going to be going on the funeral of another martyr the next morning when that happened.
You're from Nablus, and for our listeners that don't know, Nablus is very famous for its soap, but it's also very, very famous for the world's best knefe. Now,
yes,
listeners,
absolutely.
You can't see Layth, but he is about 1/5 of the size he should be, having grown up in Nablus. The most famous.
It's because I walked to the furthest knafe shop around, so just to burn some of it off.
You've not seen anything like a Nabilsi eating knefe from Al-Aqsa knefe for breakfast. A piece of knefe between two pieces of bread, like a roll.
Yes.
And eating it as a sandwich, about 5,000 calories. So,
yeah, you're set for the week then.
You are set for the week.
I think I'm going to get some soon, but I'll be disappointed.
Oh, look, it's one of those things. You land in Palestine, you do all of the tick box things, but then the very next thing you've got to do is go to Nablus and just eat knefi. Now, Layth, you wrote an article very recently that was published, and we'll put a link to this article in the podcast, so please go there and see it. It's called Israeli Violence is Central to Palestine's Mental Health Crisis. Now, you talk a lot there about the situation in Gaza, but also around the whole of Palestine with respect to the occupation and what it's doing to Palestinians' mental health. Take us through your article and extend on it if you will.
As you might see, as you may have heard from my bio, my interest is really focused on health. I really value the way in which health can be used as a lens to expose injustice. And so this is really where that came from. And, you hear over and over again things like 1,000% of Palestinians have post-traumatic stress disorder, and this many are depressed, and this many have anxiety. And there are several problems with this, and I try to engage in the main ones in the article, which inevitably means that it's just a bit of a light touch exercise. But there are two big things to really consider here. The first is that we have to be able to understand the problem. We have to really get at the root cause of it. Right. So when we diagnose in medicine, you want to understand the precise way in which a disease has developed so that you can come up with the best tools to combat that disease and heal the person in front of you. Now, public health is that, but on a much larger level. It's trying to do that to communities and countries at a time. So to understand, for example, the mental health crisis in Palestine, to understand why people exhibit symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which are things like flashbacks and being very anxious and things like that, depression, things like symptoms like lack of hope, not seeing a bright future, being down, not being able to motivate oneself to do things. Now, these things, when you put them in the context of settler colonialism, are not symptoms of disease. Right? Settler colonialism very clearly aims to subjugate people. It aims to make them hopeless. It aims to take away everything that people value in order to drive them off of their land and to stop them from resisting this violence, right? That is the core tenet of settler colonialism. So when we talk about these terms like depression and anxiety, all these kind of different symptoms, they're not because of a diseased mind. The Palestinian mind is not diseased. The disease is the colonial violence. And if you take away the colonial violence, a lot of these things would disappear. So that's the first part of the article, and that's one of the solutions to making Palestinians more hopeful, making them happier, making them more able to engage in planning for the future and things like that. And diagnosing the problem, settler colonialism, leads us to a logical solution, dismantling settler colonialism. And that's one part. The other part to consider is these definitions in and of themselves actually come from a Western perspective, which has been imposed on the rest of the world. So when we think about the relationship between a health practitioner and the patient, it's a very individualized relationship. And so invariably, health professionals end up looking at a very narrow set of personal circumstances in order to understand what someone suffers from, and then try to heal them on an individual basis. Now, that's how the Western medical establishment has conceptualized health. But that's not the same as what people all over the world want to do, right? So you will know, Nasser, and Robert, if you've interacted with a lot of Palestinians, as I'm sure you've done, you know that our community is very important to us. We experience things as a family, as a neighborhood, as a community, and that is both bil farah bil huzn, in happiness and in sadness, right? We experience these things together, and we celebrate each other's successes, and we console each other and ourselves. Take, for example, the assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh a few weeks ago. Every time a Palestinian would speak to another Palestinian for about a week, they would offer the other person their condolences while offering themselves condolences at the same time, because it shook an entire nation all over the world, all 10, 11 million of us. So we feel that on a community level, right? We feel both the sadness and the happiness on a community level. And therefore, that really individualized relationship between a doctor and a patient, between a nurse and a patient, is not really the way that if we were to have the freedom to organize our health services by ourselves, that's not the way that we would do it. And that's the same thing goes for a lot of other indigenous people. And I wouldn't want to kind of speak for any of them. But when you exchange these ideas with others from a lot of other communities, they say the same thing. And we've arrived at this point where we just, impose the same Western traditions of medicine all over the world because of colonialism as well, right? So the West colonizing the entire world, telling people exactly how they should live their lives, and then telling them they're doing it all wrong while continuing to impose the same tools to fix the problems that the West created. So that is, although, Western countries do not directly colonize a lot of the world anymore, there's persisting what we call coloniality, the imposition of these Western ideas on the rest of the world without due consideration for what the people that you're imposing these things on actually want.
Interestingly, and you spoke about in your article, whether it's Muhammad in the Gaza Strip following an interview with Médecins Sans Frontières, who said his mind is continually preoccupied with thoughts about war. Adel, who says we live in a state of constant fear. Everything feels stressed for himself and his brothers, his children, and his friends. The World Bank did a survey, 70% of Gazans and 57% of West Bank residents reported symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. When we're talking about that Western construct of post-traumatic stress disorder, you speak to it very clearly. While it's the most commonly diagnosed mental health condition in Palestine, it's inaccurate because this is a Western colonial construct which assumes the event has stopped. When in reality, as you said, the using health to expose injustice, what we've got here is a mental health challenge that is because of settler colonialism. There is no opportunity for a post. It's ongoing.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another layer to it. So you're 100% right. And it's not post. It is, this constant trauma. So that immediately goes out the window. But there's another layer to this, which is that, and I couldn't fit this into the article, but post-traumatic stress disorder actually came out of a definition of a disease that, soldiers returning from war were suffering from. So they would go and do all sorts of atrocities all over the world to brown and black bodies. And then they would go home and be preoccupied while in complete safety by the horrors that they witnessed. And you couldn't see my air quotes there, but there were air quotes there because they were the ones inflicting them, right? So they were inflicting that violence, and then they would go back and, while completely safe, have fears and stuff. And so that is, post-traumatic stress disorder was also a product of imperialism and colonialism because they were sending these young people out to do their bidding, to be violent towards people, to subjugate people, and then those people that were committing that violence were then suffering all of these horrible ailments when they came back. But there's a really kind of important part of this, which is that they had returned to safety and then they were suffering these symptoms. So, in the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated places on earth, where we've had, a teenager has suffered through 4 wars, 4 assaults, 4 brutal massacres during their lifetimes, they're obviously going to be preoccupied by thoughts of war because they've seen so much of it and they don't know when the next one will take place. So we go back to the fact that that's not a sign of a diseased mind. That's just a natural reaction to the reality that that person is living.
I think people need to also realise that the colonisation, it's calculated. I mean, the Israeli soldiers go through the villages at between 2 and 3 a.m. in the morning because they want the children to feel unsafe. They could go through any time during the day, but they tend to go at night. They tend to beat the parents in front of the kids. And it's calculated because they want to do this to the entire population, beginning from a child all the way up to the elderly. That's correct, yes. Isn't it?
Of course, it's 100% correct. And that's very accurate. And it is clear from the testimonies of Palestinians that that's what happens. But it's also by the admission of the very people who commit that violence that that's what they try to do. And it's the same when people try to, and it's, that's part of that attempt to subjugate, the checkpoints, the wall, the incarceration, the house demolitions of anyone who dares to resist, the months and months that people spend in jail for throwing a stone, like all of these things. Obviously, some of these things have more than one aim, such as the wall, which also, takes over a lot of farmland of Palestinians and cuts people off from their families and from their land. But it definitely has a primary purpose of subjugation as well.
So the entire apparatus of the Zionist occupation inevitably creates these situations. There's not a disease of the mind. It's settler colonialism, the complete lack of safety, feelings of comfort, hope for the future that are creating this mental health crisis. How do you treat a Palestinian?
This is a very question, and there are some easy kind of broad answers, but then there are more difficult kind of intricacies to try to engage with. So, we cannot solve this problem without undoing, dismantling, breaking down, whatever you want to call it, settler colonialism and other colonial structures such as coloniality. You cannot solve this problem without ending the violence. And that has to be the center of anything that we try to do to address this. And settler colonialism ends by promoting the resistance of the people who are living underneath it, by promoting cross-solidarity between communities that recognize that injustice, and promoting kind of, the resilience and resistance of people under occupation. So that has to be the center, right? But then there's obviously more immediate things that we can try to do. And this is why I talk near the end of the article about trying to reframe services focused on mental health, but health in general in Palestine, to frameworks that are context appropriate, that are born out of local solutions, traditions, and which are really owned by people who they intend to serve. So when, for example, even the vast majority of Palestinian providers will just go for the westernized model of very individual care. And that's because that's where the funding is. So they need the funding in order to survive frameworks, because that's what the Western donors impose. But what we need to do instead is create these spaces where people are offered the opportunity and granted the tools to organize and plan and articulate exactly what it is that they want. Because let's take, for example, the tradition of Sumud. Sumud means steadfastness. The way in which that is translated is essentially community solidarity, community support in order to build resilience to the various forms of colonial violence. And that is what empowers communities to stay on the land, to cope with the violence, to, come out of prison and reintegrate into normal everyday life. So that, for example, would be a concept that should be supported. And there are Palestinian organizations that try to practice this, but, that's not what donors want to fund, and that's not what people want to pay attention to. But this does this deals with both levels of colonial violence and mental health in Palestine, the settler colonialism, because it deals directly with the effects of it, but also coloniality, because it promotes a local solution that flies in the face of the Western imposed paradigms. So that would be, one thing. But what we see instead is actually there's a repression of the organizations that try to come up with local solutions. So let's take, for example, back in, I think it was October, when the Israeli military issued an order outlawing 6 Palestinian civil society organizations and condemning them as terrorist organizations. Now, we've seen very soft words being spoken by previous funders, including the European Union, of these organizations, but essentially Israel's getting away with it. These organizations are suffering. Their members are being, prohibited from traveling. Their work is being repressed. And there isn't really proper assistance, even from the donors of these organizations, that very explicitly said that there's no credibility to Israel's claims that these are terrorist organizations. And there's another organization actually that was targeted several months before these organizations, the 6, which became relatively famous, the Health Work Committee, for example. And that, that is an organization that was trying to come up with local solutions and was founded back in the 70s in order to come up with local solutions, which basically centered an anti-colonial narrative to health services. They basically said the colonial services will not serve the health needs of our people. We need to take matters into our own hands, set up these services. And over time, they've just been targeted through various means. So the introduction of the Palestinian Authority in the 90s dealt a massive blow, because essentially all of the funding that was coming into Palestine, into civil society organizations, was diverted to the neoliberal tool of colonial oppression, the Palestinian Authority, decimating these huge networks of community support. And so what we see by essentially every powerful actor in the space is they choose the way in which they want to be complicit, and they pick their favorite one and they practice it. But if anyone wants to express solidarity, it's by promoting local solutions. It's by putting power in the hands of Palestinians on the ground who are doing that anti-colonial work.
Here, brilliantly said, Layth. Layth, I'd be interested in your thoughts on intergenerational trauma, how Nakba survivors are passing it down through their families.
So the idea of intergenerational trauma is real. I often go back to kind of two ideas when I think about it. One, there's no healing without the trauma healing. And the way in which colonial violence works is that it rips people from their homes, and that rips them out of their communities, out of their land, which means that it has material impact, right? So it actually affects your ability to integrate into society, because you're always actually kind of being marginalized because, for example, you might have refugee status, or you might have this hope of return, and that constant uncertainty has material impact. The fact that people had resources stolen from them has material impact. It affects people's development, their ability to fulfill their needs and desires. So there's that impact, like that effect, even before you think about the psychological impacts, which are obviously just as real and just as visceral. And then the main problem here is that trauma is not being resolved. That trauma is not being healed. No reparations have been paid. We haven't been allowed to return to our homes. A lot of Palestinians aren't even able to visit. If they do visit, particularly if they are from the Nakba generation, then they might stand in front of a house that was stolen from their father or grandfather, and parents and grandparents, and they just feel helpless because there's a settler sitting inside of it who could legitimately shoot you and get away with it. So that trauma needs to be resolved in order to actually start healing, right? That's really important. And there's another thing that's a bit more hopeful that I just kind of want to introduce here as well, which is that although that intergenerational trauma is very painful and horrible, and a sign that the injustice is continuing, the Nakba is ongoing, it is also why Palestinian liberation is inevitable, because we may have been powerless to stop it 75 years ago, but we're not going to stay powerless forever. And so the persistence of that trauma demands a solution. And so when we do develop the tools, when we do gain the power to dismantle that violence, then we will, because we have skin in the game. It means something personally to us to resolve it. And that's, it's horrible that trauma needs to be passed down in order for justice to be served, but at least it will be.
There'll always be scars, though, unfortunately. I mean, that's part of trauma, and mental health. There's always the scars there, and I find it amazing the steadfastness of the Palestinians that do hold on to hope, because looking from the outside, there doesn't seem to be a lot. But I remember talking to some young kids when I was there, saying, what do you want to do when you grow up? And a few of them, I want to be a doctor, I want to be this. But then they'd end it with, why would I bother? There's no hope for me to do anything. There's no jobs. There's none of this. And it was just, very, very sad. But they're very powerful people, and they will win, and they will get what's deserving
justice.
to them.
Yeah, justice will be restored at
Absolutely.
some point. Interesting that you say that, Layth. Again, we're speaking to Dr. Layth Hanbali. The connection of an indigenous people to their land is unbreakable. And this is, one of the core tenets. And unlike, let's call it, and I hate to say this, effective settler colonialism, and I'm saying it's effective in air quotes, ladies and gentlemen, because of what white settler movements were able to do in Turtle Island in North America, New Zealand, and here in Australia. In Palestine, they failed. Settler colonialism works when you all but exterminate, ideally exterminate all of the indigenous people and replace them with the settler. We now represent 51+% of historic Palestine's population. And as B'Tselem and Yesh Din, Human Rights Watch, and now Amnesty International have said, we're living in apartheid. You're living there, Layth. Tell us a little bit about apartheid for you, how you've experienced it.
The first thing, because it's hot today, the first thing that comes to mind is the number of times in the summer that water just runs out. Whereas an Israeli settler, living on, for example, the village of Rujib's land, or on the lands of the village of Beta, just a few kilometers east of here, enjoys 4 times as much water as we do, for example. I might have to go on a work trip to Bethlehem next week. A settler who lives really close to where I do would be able to drive there through kind of huge, well-maintained bypass roads and get there probably in about an hour and 15-ish. I'd be very lucky if it took me 2 hours. Similar story with electricity, similar story with access to land, and we haven't even started on what actually happens in the courts. So you're talking about complete segregation with regards to basic infrastructure, with regards to basic services. The same pattern is repeated in health services. If I were to get sick, and in education, you've got these new laws coming in, where the Israeli military controls the number of academics and students that come from abroad to study or teach in Palestinian universities. When a staff member comes to a Palestinian university from the outside, they are not allowed to spend more than 1 term there, and then they would have to go away for 9 months and then come back 9 months later, and they're not allowed to serve a university for 6 months straight. That is the new rule about academics coming from the outside. So you've got this kind of complete control. Robert is rightfully outraged. I guess you haven't heard about that until now.
Well, it's just so unbelievable that people don't believe it. It's so outrageous.
Yeah. So you've got these things, and we're just talking about everyday life. We haven't talked about the fact that let's say I wouldn't do this because I don't want to associate with any settlers, but let's say a settler and I co-conspired in a crime and carried it out. I would be charged and trialed in a military court with a conviction rate of 99 point something%, whereas the settler would go to Israeli civilian court. There's a massive kind of hoo-ha going on at the moment about the extension of emergency powers to grant, essentially to extend Israeli laws to settlers in the West Bank, and that gets renewed every 5 years. And there's a lot of kind of fuss being made about it, but it will pass. Everyone's made it clear that it will pass. But essentially, they are Israeli citizens living on what the international community even considers to be Palestinian land, and it's just an extension of colonialism that started in 1948 and was expanded in 1967 and continues to expand. And has continued to expand every day since as well. So that's the reality of apartheid on the ground. It's a completely segregated system where Israeli settlers live one life and Palestinians live a completely different life.
Just on that Israeli settler, illegal settler, he wouldn't go to court probably, would he? The chances of him getting charged are very slim anyway.
Yeah.
It depends what the crime was, Rob. I think if they ran over a Palestinian, they'd find a way to convict Layth, but they'd let the settler go.
Right. Yeah.
Layth, we've run out of time. Thanks so very much for joining us, Dr. Layth Hanbali. Now, make sure you go to the podcast, ladies and gentlemen, and click on that article. You'll be very impressed with Layth's writing. We'll put a couple of other pieces in there as well. Thanks so much for joining us, Layth.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation. Thank you so much to your listeners as well. Thank you.
We'll do it again.
And Rob, I look forward to seeing you in the studio next week, and make sure you call in and speak to Rob and I for Radiothon 3CR. Thanks for listening. Share the podcast, and remember, there's never been a better time for a free Palestine.